With the Famicom and NES systems selling incredibly well in many countries during the late 1980s, it's no surprise that some of Sega's IPs would show up there. The history of these games is actually quite interesting, mainly because the games that were brought out on the Japanese Famicom were not always the same exact game that was brought out on the NES in North America. We are going to look at all these games, as well as a bonus game that wasn't quite Sega's, but still connected to their brands. I hope you guys enjoy Sega and the Nintendo Entertainment System. Sega's IPs first showed up on the Japanese Famicom via Sunsoft in 1987, with a port of the arcade classic Fantasy Zone. This is actually a really good representation of that game, with good color, responsive gameplay, and even a really nice sounding lineup of music. The tiny cartridge even managed to keep the weapons that comprise the game's power-up system. Sunsoft was always a great maker of games back in the 80s, and Fantasy Zone here is no exception. We'd also see Fantasy Zone's follow-up on the Japanese Famicom in 1988, Fantasy Zone 2 The Tears of Opa Opa, renamed here as The Teardrop of Opa Opa. Sunsoft was teamed with Senritsu for this one, and while this isn't a bad overall port of the Sega Master System and arcade original, it falls a bit short of the first game. It feels a bit slower and less smooth, and the music isn't as good either. The sequel here would see a few important changes to the formula of the first. You now travel through warp gates to different areas of the same stage and try and take down the enemy bases. You can also power yourself up at the shop at any time. The lack of a radar really hurts this game's playability in my opinion, as it's far harder to locate the bases you need to kill. It's still a fun game, but I advise the Sega Master System version if you want the best experience. Sunsoft would also release Alien Syndrome in 1988, once again teaming with Senritsu. I was a big fan of the original arcade version of this, especially its two-player mode. The Famicom port keeps most of the gameplay intact, including its many power-ups and large boss fights. I had always been a little let down by the Sega Master System version of this, and while certainly not arcade perfect, I can't help but to think the Famicom did a better job here. It isn't as colorful as the Sega Master System version, and although it's a tad slower, the gameplay just feels better. The weakest aspect is without question the music and sound effects. The NES was known to belt out some truly classic tunes, yet all this game can muster are some random blips and bloops. Otherwise, this is a home run for Famicom collectors. (1989) would see the release of Afterburner 2 on the Famicom, and surprise, Sunsoft again was at control of the port. Much like the Master System version of Afterburner, this was heavily cut back from the arcade original. Gone are the gorgeous super scaling sprites that made the original so damn impressive. What's left here is a bare bones shoot 'em up that mostly plays like it should, but lacks the thrills of the original arcade. Afterburner's gameplay was never what I'd call deep beyond its difficulty and twitch-based mechanics, so to not have the visual feel here leaves the experience feeling hollow. I do admire the attempt to port such a high-powered arcade to the meager Famicom hardware, however, and there are aspects of this one that still make it worth taking a look at. Takara took a shot at making Sega games in 1989, releasing a Famicom port of the arcade classic shooter Space Harrier. Now of course when this came out originally I had no clue it existed. It would be years later before I knew about it, and even then I had to chuckle at the idea of Space Harrier on Nintendo's 8-bit hardware. Surely it was a joke, right? It absolutely isn't, and Takara actually did a surprisingly solid job given the gulf of power between the original arcade and the Famicom. As you can imagine, there are a ton of concessions here, starting with the size and amount of on-screen sprites. Everything is smaller, there is less of it, and it all runs much slower. There are also no voice samples in the game at all, likely due to the tiny 1 megabit cartridge. In the plus column, things are fairly smooth here, and it does retain many of the more impressive stage effects from the arcade. This won't replace any of the other versions of Space Harrier out there on better hardware, but this is still far from the worst game on the system. Someone at Interlink, the guys that developed this, must have lost a bet or messed with somebody's wife, because they got the task of developing Altered Beast on the Famicom in 1990, which was then published by Asmik. I'm not gonna beat around the bush here, this is not a good version of this game. Much of the thrill of Altered Beast was its 2-player co-op, its animal transformations, and its large boss fights. You lose all of that here, and the awful graphics drag it down further. I did appreciate the faster gameplay and extra stages, but none of this made up for the way it looks and sounds. Altered Beast was a game of simple joys. Take those away and what you're left with is a hollow experience not worth the journey. When it came to the North American market and the NES, Sega's IPs were handled by Tengen, or whatever the hell it is. The interesting part about this was that these Sega games were completely unlicensed by Nintendo of America. They were sold at budget prices and pissed Nintendo off like you wouldn't believe. This resulted in a lawsuit between the two companies that would last half a decade. There are 4 unlicensed Sega games in total produced by Tengen for the NES in North America. The first of these games was Afterburner in 1989, a modified version of the Famicom release of Afterburner 2. Most of what I said about Sunsoft's version applies here as well. While this does make numerous cosmetic changes to the Famicom version, it remains similar in overall feel and gameplay. It was definitely worth a look at its original budget price. Lucky for us here in North America, Tengen wouldn't mess with Alien Syndrome much at all, and released it pretty much just how it was on the Famicom. It keeps the 2-player simultaneous co-op and arcade setup. It was a solid run-and-gun shooter on the NES, especially at its low price. Out of all of Tengen's releases on the NES, Fantasy Zone here is perhaps the strangest. Whereas they just licensed Sunsoft's work previously, they decided to make their own version of Fantasy Zone for the NES from scratch. It's completely different, right down to your status bar, gameplay, and even the music and visuals. The NES version here sounds better sometimes, while the Famicom release tends to look a bit better. I can't really crap on either version of the game. They both have their strengths and neither is a bad experience. This one was again a budget release selling for $19.99 in an era of $50 NES games. If I had to choose one to go with, I'd probably take the NES version for its more forgiving difficulty and its music. There was also Shinobi, released in 1989 and the only Sega game on the NES directly based on its Master System counterpart. Outside of a few weapon changes, being able to super jump at any time, and stage layout modifications, this is pretty much the Master System game. The music is even eerily close to its source material. The graphics do take a hit in color, but again are very close. I remember buying this from an old drugstore chain called Far More when it was released. Back then, budget titles had been my only source of new games, and I just loved it despite its shortcomings. If you want the better overall experience today, you want the Sega Master System version, of course. But for a cheap NES game in 1989, this was the best thing ever. The last game I want to go over for the NES wasn't a directly Sega-owned property, but stemmed from a popular game they had the rights to. Adventure Island originally hit the Famicom in 1986, and then 2 years later on the NES. This game was based on Wonder Boy, an arcade game that Sega had worked with a company called Escape to create. Sega retained the naming rights to this game and would go on to publish many more in the series. Escape kept the rights to the actual game design itself, and would license this to Sunsoft, who in turn created Adventure Island with it. Seeing the two games side by side, it is obvious they are cut from the same cloth. You get some cosmetic changes on the characters, but otherwise it's damn near identical. Sunsoft had so much success with Adventure Island that it would see a few sequels on the NES as well. Escape would go on to become Westone and make many more games for Sega in the Wonder Boy series. As with the vast majority of its IPs back then, Sega would not directly develop or publish any of its games on the Famicom or NES. It left this up to other companies by selling the rights to the content to them and allowing them to develop their own versions. This typically meant that from version to version, Sega games were all over the place in regards to quality and differences. Some of the developers did bang-up jobs bringing Sega's classic games to other hardware, while others were much less impressive. I think most of these NES and Famicom ports turned out far better than they had any right to, especially the budget-friendly North American releases. I remember thinking back then how cool it was that Sega games were coming out on the NES, and maybe I'd see other great games like Outrun and Phantasy Star. That of course never happened, and when Sega released the Genesis in 1989, it closed down all license deals that put its newest IPs on other hardware. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.